everyone, my name is Alex Shepherd. I'm one of the product managers at Unchained Labs, and I will be your moderator today. Thank you for joining us. So we'll have a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. If you wish to submit a question, just click on the Q&A button in your Zoom navigation bar at the top or bottom of your screen and type your question. When submitting a question, please avoid clicking the anonymous button so that we can reach out via email if we don't get to your question today. We will try to get through as many of them as we can. And now I'd like to introduce Delray Jackson, Marketing Manager for Big Tuna at Unchained Labs. Today, Del will walk you through the new features of Big Tuna and how this automated buffer exchange solution can help you coast through the sample prep of your biomolecules. Over to you, Del.
Thank you, Alex. Hopefully you're all seeing my screen right now. Nice introduction. For those of you that don't know, that was actually Alex who plays the bass on that hold music that we got to enjoy right before we started. But I'm here to talk to you today about getting flippin' flexible biomolecule sample prep with powered up Big Tuna. Lots of words there. I'm also really excited about today's virtual seminar. Excited about all of them, but today in particular, because we're going to show off some new features with the Big Tuna 3.0 software release that just came out a couple weeks ago. But before we get into that, I want to share this image of the Phantom Galaxy. If you're a fellow astrology nerd like myself, you'll recognize this as one of the images that we owe credit to the James Webb Space Telescope for capturing, or the JWT for short. What's really cool about this picture is it helps give insight into how stars are formed. And you can see the structures of heat emitting dust and gas here, really gorgeous to look at. But it's an image we almost didn't get because the JWT actually suffered a malfunction in the software that controls the direction of it. But thankfully, because they caught it early, they got the data early about the state of the James Webb Space Telescope, they were able to fix it and then capture images like this and much more data. And I share that story with you because it really highlights the importance of getting data quickly, right? Getting data early on in your drug discovery, drug development process. And in doing so, you'll know that buffer exchange is one of those tasks that's really essential. We make these different biomolecules, lipid nanoparticles, viral vectors, prepare, proteins, antibodies, nucleic acids. And typically, the buffer that they're made in has to be exchanged for various reasons. For LNPs, we know that ethanol, typically you want to remove that quickly, or you're just screening a lot of different conditions for stability on your LNPs. With AAVs or viral vectors in general, often made dilute. And so what we hear is that customers need to concentrate those down, pretty quickly. Nucleic acids often have to be desalted before they can be analyzed downstream, very critical for them. And then proteins, antibodies, those are the ones that get a lot of look at with formulation, selection, and optimization. And buffer exchange is used at every step of the way. And like many people that we talk to, you may be using manual methods for it. It's very understandable. Most of us have a fridge and a stir plate, so dialysis is very accessible. Same with centrifugation using spin filters. And then TFF, is also an available technology that people are using for buffer exchange. Now, these techniques, although they do have their value, where they really stop short is giving you, high throughput, doing lots of different samples or lots of different conditions at once, and giving you that data, that insight early on. And additionally, dialysis can be slow. If you use spin columns, you are probably familiar with the phenomenon of aggregation or gelling up at the membrane interface. And then for TFF, interesting technology, but often does require larger volumes, to make it worth your time, I would say, the setup time required to process your samples on it. And this is where Big Tuna comes in. This is what you signed up for the webinar for, or what you're tuning in after the fact. And so Big Tuna really is the high throughput automated buffer exchange and sample concentration solution on the market. Reasons being, you can do up to 96 exchanges or sample concentrations in parallel. You have a big working volume range from 100 microliters all the way up to 48 mils. We'll get into later exactly, the 48 mil aspect of that. And a really cool part is it's fast. It's very easy to set up, and you'll see some examples of that in a moment. Key part of why Big Tuna is the high throughput buffer exchange solution is because everything is done in plate-based format. The filtration plates that we used refer to unfilters. They come in two formats, a 96 and a 24 well. The working volume range for the 96 starts at that 100 microliters, goes up to 450 microliters. From there, the unfiltered 24, each of those 24 wells have a working volume range of 450 microliters, all the way up to 8 mils. Both of them use regenerated cellulose membrane, which is great. This is the leading membrane material for ultra-filtration or for the biomolecules that we are looking at. And mostly because it has very low specific affinity for stuff. So it's pretty ubiquitous, pretty benign to be used with a wide variety of biomolecules. Both unfilters come in 10, 30, and 100 kilodalton membrane options. The 96 has an additional offering at the 3 kilodalton molecular weight cutoff. Cool part about Big Tuna is summarized here for all of us. Our technology on Big Tuna, how does it, you might be thinking, how does it differ from dialysis or centrifugation or TFF? It's essentially an automated pressure-based ultrafiltration diafiltration solution. The pressure comes in 15, 30, or 60 psi. It's even pressure that's applied across the entire plate in a buffer exchange chamber, which we'll see in a moment. But what I really want you to appreciate from this slide is the fact that Big Tuna measures the volume of every single sample. It does this at the beginning of a run, and then what the arrow in the middle is supposed to represent are the subsequent buffer exchange cycles that your samples will undergo as you exchange them or concentrate them. At the end of every single one of those cycles, the flow rate or the volume measurement is done for each sample, giving Big Tuna an idea of the flow rate for it, and then it can adapt the amount of time that positive pressure is applied. And that's really cool. What it means is that Big Tuna will prioritize and protect your sample integrity, your sample recovery, because it will adapt the amount of time for all of the samples to get pressure, which accounts for those cases where sometimes maybe one sample, perhaps it's in a different buffer, has different excipients, it might be flowing really fast. Big Tuna is not going to let that dry out. So it's a great advantage there. And then at the end, once your target buffer exchange value is hit for every single one of your samples, Big Tuna optionally can also concentrate after the fact, or it can also just concentrate if you don't need to do buffer exchange as well. The second cool technology, so volume sensor, individual volume sensor, is really interesting. In addition to that, we also have orbital mixing. So the unfilters in the buffer exchange chamber optionally can be mixed very gently. It's a programmable setting, and we have presets available for you. And this gives you two things. It allows you to have faster flow rates, so your buffer exchange can be done quicker, but not at the sacrifice of sample integrity. So the other thing it gives you is good sample recovery, because as you can see on the slide on the left, we avoid dead-end ultrafiltration. We keep your biomolecules of interest in solution in the retentate and away from that membrane material to eliminate and avoid any sort of aggregation that can occur. So I said you can work up to 48 mils, but for those of you savvy enough, you could see that neither the unfiltered 24 or the unfiltered 96 allow 48 mils a sample. So to allow you to concentrate those higher volume preps, we have a reduced sample volume application where you can concentrate all the way up to about 100-fold at the end. You could take samples from 48 mils all the way down to 500 microliters. And then you can go even farther in the unfiltered 96 there if you need to. The way that this is accomplished, as you can see from the nice cartoon on the screen, is that we keep some of your samples on the deck outside of the unfilters. And if it's a little bit confusing right now, understand we haven't seen a close-up yet of Big Tuna, but it will make sense in a few slides. So speaking of Big Tuna, I had said, that everyone in your lab can use it, that they can set it up in less than 15 minutes. One of the ways that we enable that is that you have control over these different factors. And some of them are shown here, the most important ones for buffer exchange, one being percent removal. That's how much buffer in every single one of those buffer exchange cycles where we pressurize all of your samples in the unfilter, basically how much does Big Tuna want to take out in each of those? It could be as much as 75% or as low as 10% if needed. Why is that valuable? Well, many biomolecules have concentration dependent behavior, essentially precipitation. So proteins, of course, and even nucleic acids, if they get too concentrated, they can fall out of solution or they can tend to aggregate. You have control over that with Big Tuna by being able to fine tune that percent removal. And percent exchange, of course, that's useful. No more guessing if you've spun down enough or if you've left the samples in the dialysis bucket long enough. You can tell Big Tuna exactly that buffer exchange percentage that you want to hit, whether it's 99.9%, or maybe you just need to do a quick 92% exchange, whatever it might be, you have control and you can program it on Big Tuna. And then finally, final concentration, you can set that. Now it's a concentration factor that you can set in Big Tuna 3.0 software. And you can say like, hey, I want a 2x or a 5x, whatever it is you want at the end. And Big Tuna will give you that in the final volume. Let's talk about how quick it is to set up Big Tuna. How long do these runs take? Well, it's variable, but using IgG, our favorite sort of reference biomolecule here at Unchained Labs, we can give you an example with both 96 and 24 on filters, sort of like expected runtimes. And typically, they'll fit like for things that are very viscous or that may perhaps flow slowly for other reasons, that can take, a couple hours. But oftentimes when you're working with dilute preps, or dilute preps that flow a little bit faster, you could be done in just a couple hours. The nice thing though is regardless of how long it takes, Big Tuna will keep you informed every step of the way of what's happening. And you can see that in that bottom screenshot on the slide right now in the software, showing you the overall experiment progress, but also a sample by sample progress breakdown. And that's really cool because, if it takes 3 hours or 4 hours, it doesn't really matter. Big Tuna will keep you informed so you can plan your schedule, you can work on other preps, you can do some data analysis. And you also have an idea of the software here if you're a current fan of Unchained already. If you have one of our other products like Leprechaun or Stunner, for instance, you'll see that same approach to software, making sure that software is usable by every scientist and technician in your lab, is also in play with Big Tuna. And here you can see that you can set up some pretty elaborate formulations by hand in the software as well. So if you're doing formulation screens, it's really nice on Big Tuna, but we'll talk in a moment about how it's even easier to do that by importing your data. And then one other thing I think I'll take a moment to mention here, this pause button is also a nice feature. If you have any samples, as the graphic here shows, that might already be done, and for whatever reason, you just want to take those out and let the run continue, you can pause the experiment, pipette those samples out, and then resume the run. So let's take a look at Big Tuna. The hardware itself, it is an automated liquid handler, but it's specifically designed and built to do buffer exchange and sample concentration. So here we can see the primary components, the important components on it. We'll start off with that ultrasonic volume check. That's located here to the left of the buffer exchange chamber. It uses acoustic technology, and basically it just bounces sound waves down off the top of the liquid. We do some accounting for the meniscus values because that can vary, but essentially you can get a well by well or sample by sample volume check using that tool. That tool is actually picked up by the gripper over here that you see indicated by number 5. That gripper does dual duty. In addition to picking up the ultrasonic volume sensor, it also moves the tips. You have up to 6 in the tip hotel on the right, to and from the tip hotel and the deck. That unfilter sits right here in the buffer exchange chamber. What's not shown is the door that closes and brings that buffer exchange chamber up to 15, 30, or 60 PSI. And then finally, the 6-tip arm. This is great. It has an expandable Y raster. We'll see that in a moment. So you can put either an unfilter 96 or an unfilter 24 in Big Tuna, and it'll be able to work with it. It adapts for itself. And then lastly, what's not super clear perhaps, but you have space on top of the buffer exchange chamber, as well as some additional 6 spots. So for a total of 8 sample buffer reservoirs, or in the case of that reduced sample volume, this is where your samples would fit. So enough of me talking, let's see Big Tuna in action. And so this, again, is what happens at the beginning of every run, where the gripper arm will come over, pick up that volume sensor, that acoustic sensor tool, and it will go through and it will measure every single sample, its volume, and it does that again at the end of every run. And using that information, Big Tuna is going to know the exact flow rate for each of your samples, and again, uses that information to compensate and make sure none of your samples dry out. Oops, that's the same one. Let's go to the next. It was good, but not that good to watch it again. The other cool part of Big Tuna is that the buffer additions are done for you, or sample additions if you're going at reduced sample volume. And so again, we have the 6-tip arm here. It uses liquid displaced air pipetting technology. The pumps are here on the left now in the graphic. And this is key because this is the primary way where your day is going to be freed up. So no longer do you have to be tied to a centrifuge or be checking on certain instrumentation. Big Tuna is going to handle all of the buffer and sample additions for you. And if you're interested in high throughput buffer exchange, then there's a pretty good chance that you have upstream and downstream instrumentation or automation that you'd like to integrate with. Big Tuna has a CELA 2 compatible API that's basically just states that our API is ready to go for lab automation. So whatever orchestration software you or your IT or your automation group might use, it's going to be super quick and easy to get Big Tuna set up with it. And that gives you a lot more power. It allows you, again, to integrate to upstream automation. So perhaps you have another piece of equipment that's preparing your samples, and it can put it into the unfilter. You're able to now place that right into Big Tuna, and you don't have to get involved. The automation can be set up so that it starts the run automatically for you. Or perhaps you want to tie in the analytics. Maybe you want to characterize your samples before buffer exchange and after buffer exchange. Of course, the Stunner and the Lunatic are great high throughput options. Also, they each have their own API. And you can set up this nice little ecosystem with Big Tuna in your integrated automation. But regardless whether or not you're working in an integrated environment or you're just stepping up and using Big Tuna to take care of your high throughput buffer exchange needs, the presets are going to make it that much easier. So they're set up according to your biomolecule and even your the sample concentration for that biomolecule. And it changes things like the pressure and the target removal. But if you have already optimized Big Tuna to your biomolecules for your lab sort of work and processes, then you can customize it and actually save those settings yourself. All right, so we talked about the problem, the need to do high throughput buffer exchange, showing Big Tuna's capabilities, but now let's see some proof of that in action of how it can be used at your, any step really in your sample, drug discovery, drug development processes. So for purification, sample prep, characterization, and then of course it's a true workhorse for doing any sort of developability and formulation studies. And it's a wide range of biomolecules. So we talked about, the menu of them at the beginning of this, and we don't know exactly what you're working with, but whatever it is, if you're working in biologics and gene therapy, drug development, Big Tuna can work for you. So here's a quick example of AAVs, LNPs, some nucleic acids, and then again, IgG are great standard. And these are example recoveries that you can get, but across the board, they're quite high. Yeah. All right, so some more data for you. We're all scientists most likely here, interested in seeing the results. And so this is an internal experiment that we set up. And we did it to show off one of our new features, which I'll get to in just a moment. But this is an example formulation screen setup using our 10 kilodalton unfiltered 96. And what we're going to do is look at, different monoclonal antibody concentrations, different pHs, and different ionic strengths. And it's easier to see it visually, of course, so let me show that for you. And here you can see that as we go down in rows, we're increasing our concentration from 0.5 all the way up to 5 mg per mil for the monoclonal antibody. And then in each of the 4 columns going from left to right, the first 4 are for pH 5, next for 6, and then the final 4 columns are for pH 7. And at each of those pHs, we set up varying ionic strength. So sodium chloride concentration going from 0 all the way up to 18. And you could set this up manually on Big Tuna with the point and click. We're not doing a software demo right now, but a new feature is that you can, in addition to importing sample lists that have the position and sample details associated with it, you can now import buffer lists that also have the positional data. And so you could always import buffer lists before, but with Big Tuna 3.0, now you can actually vary, for every single buffer in your list, the exact position of where it needs to go. So very, very cool, makes it even easier to set up, a complicated screen like this on Big Tuna. And what happens when you run it? Well, Big Tuna goes with the flow. And I really like this data because it shows that the sample concentration doesn't affect the viscosity or the flow rate, the viscosity as much as I would have expected. So oftentimes I talk about Big Tuna, I'll say like, oh yeah, with increasing, sample concentration, your viscosity goes up. And so you can see that that's most likely why your flow rates go down. But here, in this case, flow rates decrease by 42% across these concentration range with 10x higher, but the viscosity stays pretty normal over this concentration range. But one cool thing is, regardless of the other takeaways for this, is that for each of these sample concentrations, all 96 samples, greater than 95% recovery was achieved in about 6 hours time. And so we talked about getting data, getting data early, and typically, where Big Tuna is used in the drug discovery process in phase 1, it's early on, you're screening a lot of conditions or a lot of different potential candidates. And here's an example of the data that you get that you don't get with those other techniques. But on Big Tuna, you can get the average flow rate for every single sample across the whole run. And me being a data nerd, I took this and put it in Excel and looked at it in a couple different ways. So if you just apply a heat map to the flow rates for all samples, as expected, as you go down, the flow rates decrease. But now if we look at it in different ways, so we can depict the trends according to just the individual concentration factors, or as a function of ionic strength, or as a function of pH. And this data can be very useful to help you optimize and really perfect the sample recovery that you're going to get with your samples. As an example, here you can see that, yes, flow rates do decrease as a function of increasing concentration, but one interesting thing is that low ionic strength, or the lack of ionic strength, can actually recover at each of the pHs those flow rates. Again, just a really cool thing about Big Tuna, in addition to freeing you up from manual buffer exchange, you also get all of the data, complete picture of what it does for each and every one of your samples. All right, we do live in the real world. Big Tuna is designed to operate in the real world, and in that real world, there are sometimes imperfect preps. And so for you, many of our Big Tuna customers work sort of like as a core facility, if you will, meaning that other groups will give them samples to prepare. And even though they might tell those other groups, their coworkers, like, hey, I need all of my samples to be at the same initial starting volume, which is a requirement, a recommended requirement for Big Tuna, automated UFDF technology. That doesn't always happen. Or of course, even though we've all had lots of practice at pipetting samples, when you're going 96 all at once, pipette errors could occur. And so you might have a variation in your unfilter in the initial starting volume. And so to give sort of a show off, a new feature that we have that can address this situation, we intentionally vary the initial volume of a stock monoclonal antibody, setting up this run 96 samples. The target is 400 microliters, so that's what they should start at. So we have some of them that are at 400, but intentionally we put lower volumes at 280, 320, and 360 of the other ones to show off a new feature that we have, normalize initial volumes. What this can do is fix lower than expected volumes that you're going to run on Big Tuna. And you can see that it works as expected. So the final concentration values at the end as a function of, again, these are all the same prep, so they're at the same concentration, but at different volumes, you can see that Big Tuna got all 96 samples exchanged in 90 minutes and kept it at the expected final volume for you. And so what this means is that with this new feature, you can have more consistent runs, consistent recoveries, because Big Tuna can automatically now compensate for deviations in lower than expected initial sample volumes. So there we go. Thanks for letting me show off Big Tuna. Hopefully now you can appreciate that all of your buffer exchange and sample concentration needs can be met with it. And additionally, it can give you that data and that insight early on, so you can start making those critical decisions to help hopefully save you time and resources in your drug development process. Just like finding out early on the James Webb Telescope needed a slight correction, we were able to get some cool results early on. With that, I'll hand it back to Alex, and thank you all.
Thank you, Del, for taking us through those new features and showing us how Big Tuna can help save time with early lead analysis. So we have some great questions that have already been submitted. Remember, you can still ask a question by clicking on the Q&A button on your Zoom navigation bar. So to kick us off, our first question is, can I cool my samples while running or put Big Tuna into a cold room?
We don't cool while running. That would definitely have an effect on the flow rates for it. And we do not recommend or support having Big Tuna in a cold room because of some of the condensation factors. We do understand, though, that customers are concerned about keeping, their preps, their precious samples at room temperature. So, but what many have discovered is that because of the speeds that they get, Alex, in processing on Big Tuna, that's usually, it doesn't matter. It's not long enough to really affect their sample integrity.
Thanks, Del. We've had a couple of questions on alternate membrane chemistries. So do you have plans to develop any other membrane chemistries besides regenerated cellulose? And one person specifically asking about PEZ membranes.
So great question. They might be aware that Anunnaki, which is the same buffer exchange technology, but just in a lower format solution, came out with PEZ UNAs. As a product manager, believe me, I ask for everything on Big Tuna. If I could, this thing would have a cup holder, and racing stripes on the side of it. So I don't have anything I can announce yet, but you can probably guess that, of course, we're very interested, very committed to having a high throughput buffer exchange solution. And part of that would probably entail having alternative membranes, but nothing, sorry, to announce right now.
Thanks, Del. A question on LMPs. Do you see any size change when buffer exchanging LMPs?
Yeah, so an LMP researcher for sure. So that's a common problem across all techniques with LMPs, and really the gold standard is dialysis, which delivers, I would say, a rule of thumb, the smallest size changes. With LMPs on Big Tuna, we have seen for some chemistries and some situations size change, but typically through some application tweaking, I would say, we're able to keep it fairly minimal. But yeah, I don't want to give the impression that there's zero size change, but we have reduced it with, again, showing off the power of Big Tuna is that you can tweak a bunch of the knobs, a bunch of the factors on it. And by doing so, we have achieved, acceptable LMP sample integrity results.
Next question is, how can you set up orbital mixing functions? What conditions or sample types would you recommend using this function for?
Yeah, good question. So the orbital mixing, I would recommend using it at all times. And so, customers can be very worried about like, well, was that going to change? Is it going to hurt my samples, essentially? So what we've done several studies, activity-based studies as well, and our customers have, showing that orbital mixing, because it's orbital and it's controllable, so you can reduce the RPMs down, that they don't really affect it. And so the way that we use it is that as we're applying positive pressure, we're doing that orbital mixing, again, to keep those flow rates going as fast as possible.
Awesome. Thank you for the tips. Next question is, what percentage do you lose during the concentration of proteins or antibodies?
What percentage should we lose? So it is sample dependent. Our specifications are based upon IgG, and so I can't say specifically for the protein or antibody that you can work with. But what we do see is that we have about 95% recovery, so we would have about a loss of 5%. And sometimes it's greater than that, but sometimes there are certain biomolecules. AAV2 always comes to mind, although now we do much better with those. But in the past, before we figured out the application settings, we'd have a little bit lower recovery with those. But in general, about 5% loss, I would say.
Next question is, have you compared Big Tuna exchange samples with other methods, for example, TFF, for any downstream applications or analysis? So
yes, we have compared. We've looked at the results in the literature. We don't currently have a TFF system in-house, but yeah, we do compare that. And I don't want to throw shade on TFF or any of the other manual techniques. They can give you similar results for it. But the key part of Big Tuna is that you're not going to sacrifice any sample recovery. So if you're having good sample recovery on TFF, most likely get that on Big Tuna as well. But now you're going to get all of that data. You're going to have that ability to do up to 96 samples at once. And you're not going to have to babysit it. It just does it on its own.
I think we've got time for one or two more questions. How does the normalize initial volume handle samples above the target volume?
So if they're above the target volume, and so Big Tuna can do volume measurements based upon absolute and relative values, let's say that for now. And so anything that's perceived to be below the target volume, it's going to bring up. If it's above it, though, it just leaves it at that and sort of compensates for it. So at the end, if you're 10% above the initial target volume, you're still going to remain at 10% above. We're not going to pipette your sample out or do anything weird like that.
Great, thanks, Del. Final question: how long does it take to process 96 AAV samples?
It's hard to tell you specifically for that, but rule of thumb, and we do have tech notes on this we can share with you after the fact. But I would say AAV is one of the sample types that tend to flow very quick. So I would guess 96 can be done in about an hour's time.
Great, thanks, Del, for taking it. Thanks for answering all those great questions and for your great presentation. I'd also like to thank everyone that joined us live today and those of you that submitted questions. If you'd like to have a deeper conversation with a member of our team, then please contact us at info@unchainedlabs.com, or you can learn more on our website, unchainedlabs.com. Thank you again for attending today's virtual seminar, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.